This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
This is Paul Verschure with the Convergent Science Network podcast. And today I have a conversation with Dana Ballard, who is also speaker in our summer school here in Barcelona. And Dana, in your presentation, which focused very much on vision, you started out by making a pretty strong point about why, let's say, the standard notion of feed-forward saliency maps actually don't really do the job in vision. So what's the problem with sort of the standard notion of a saliency map, and why is it not sufficient?
Wow, Paul. Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me here. It's a lot of fun, and the establishment is very new and beautiful. But as for your question, the problem, people who aren't vision scientists take vision for granted, and every person has the sensation of vision of being a person on the street and being in the middle of a very beautiful three-dimensional movie. So the act of seeing is completely taken for granted. Whereas if you, as a scientist, if you start to examine the brain and how vision works, how the images are gathered and sent to the brain, then you get a completely different picture. And it's almost untenable picture from the standpoint of everyday experience. And so the hardest thing to come to grips with, as I mentioned in my talk, is the binocular visual system has only good resolution in a tiny, tiny place in the middle of the gaze vector. So it's 1 degree. So if a person holds his arm at arm's length, the width of the thumb is the place where you have very, very good resolution. You can read. Outside of that, the resolution becomes so poor that you can't even read out that. And as I mentioned in my lecture, that people found this out by changing the letters outside of the gaze point. So people started to think, if this is true, where should the eyes go? If there's tiny little sort of pistol of good resolution that you're pointing around the visual world, and I should also mention that the visual system is discrete, so that we're not aware of it, but every third of a second we change our eyes to a different point. And so if this is true, where should we look? And so a substantial group of scientists thought that where you would look is saliency. So the pieces of the image that are most visually complicated, like if you're wearing a wristwatch, or if you're holding some bracelet, or just the eyes of another person, those are places where the image is busy. And the thought is that, well, those would be candidate places. And so the original thinking was, well, those are candidate places, and somehow the brain knows how to pick one of those from moment to moment. But I would say another camp, a camp of which I'm a member, is the idea that, well, that might not be true, because it might be more agenda-driven. So this is very, very hard to get used to, but it could be that vision is really a succession of information-gathering experiences, and where you point your eyes to get some quanta of information, and then somehow the brain knows how to integrate these quanta into some sensation, which it calls seeing. And no one knows exactly how this works. If anybody figures it out, it's a Nobel Prize for sure. But at the moment, we're still sort of trying to guess some of the constraints that would lead us on the right path towards understanding this, and that's the saliency thing. So the saliency is really an initial try. And now the agenda faction thinks they are the second try.
Okay, but now, would you believe in some sort of compromise between these two schools of thought? Is that the solution, or you really think it's going to be either one or the other?
Okay, I know I'm in Europe, and it's appropriate to compromise. So one issue where you might be able to compromise is the following: is that if vision is entirely agenda-driven, then the issue comes up of, well, when would you ever change your agenda? So if you're driving along and you're paying attention to the car in front of you, and what would make you pay attention to, say, a small child runs in front of the car? What would make you pay attention? So a compromise would be to take busy places in the image, but then you get to pick and choose them according to your agenda. So in front of the car, you would set it up so that you're sensitive to motion, any irregular movement. So in the car, when you're moving along, there's lots of motion, but it's very expected motion. But if there's some unexpected motion, and you can quantify this on a computer, if there's some unexpected, let's call it salient motion, then you would allow yourself to be interrupted and deal with that. So, so the compromise would be that you have agenda-driven saliency, where you can modify what's interesting in the image depending on your.
But then, so one experiment that you described was, let's say, your litter gathering experiment, right? Where you actually try to also dissect now what this more agenda-driven form of attention might look like, what its components could be, and how they could possibly work together. So what was the key idea behind that experiment?
Well, the key idea is that everyone would like to, every scientist or such a huge group of scientists would like to solve the last big mystery: how does the brain work? And so, how does thinking work? And there's a very sharp fork in the road as to whether you can think the system can be composed of primitives. So is there some way to break intelligence down so that you have these little quantum pieces, and then so you can get very complicated behaviors by picking and choosing pieces like a puzzle? And people, one thought is that, well, from what we are learning about the brain, the amount of pieces in your puzzle has to be small, say less than 10. And so this is another idea. It's very hard to get used to, but people are starting to think along this line. That you have a lot of puzzle pieces, but for the puzzle you want to make, you have to pick a small amount of them in the time. And so, of course, in the laboratory, we tend to become more and more modest in the kinds of problems we tackle because of technical difficulties. And so in the problem you mentioned, we actually have human subjects in a virtual environment. They're walking down a sidewalk in the city, and there's litter there to pick up. They have that job, and then there's obstacles to go around, and then they have to stay on the sidewalks. That's 3 things to do at a time. And so we ask the question, well, can we keep track of the agenda during these 3 simultaneous tasks? Can we watch it and tell which one the brain's working on? And so we use the eye movements. We analyze the eye movement traces and report on what task is immediately being worked on there. And the hope is, of course, that if we can understand how to do 3 tasks, then lots and lots of tasks are just around the corner, as long as we can pick them in successions of 3 or 5 or 10.
Right. But in this case, the task you try to decompose is always going back to an eye movement, right? It's either an eye movement in the service of picking up the litter, or an eye movement in the service of avoiding an obstacle. Or is that a too limited interpretation?
No, not at all. I mean, it's that you have your 5 senses, and I always say vision is the most important. Other people say, no, taste is the most important, because if you lose that, you'll eat poison and die. But if you want to get information from a considerable distance, and you want to get very elaborate, rich sources of what's out there in the world, you can't beat vision. And so the number of people studying vision probably dwarf the number of people studying the rest of the senses. And so vision is so important that we feel if we understand that one, the other senses will fall. will fall. The other people are working on the other way. They think, let's go simple first and try to understand one of the simpler senses, and then we can build up. But vision is certainly attracted the attention of many, many researchers.
Right. But now in your task, in this decomposition of a task, so we have the litter gathering, avoiding the obstacle, stay on the path, right? And you map that into, let's say, 3 behavioral modules that would drive the eye movements or the gaze. But now, in some sense, that's like a one-to-one mapping of, let's say, properties of the virtual world, because either it's litter, that's one module, or an obstacle, other module, or it's the path, other obstacle, it's the other module. So if you have a mapping, let's say, one-to-one between behavioral modules and the relevant objects in the world, would you get an explosion of behavioral modules?
Well, you would, of course, if you did it incorrectly. And so it's always embarrassing in science how you sweep certain problems under the rug. And so, as you point out, for our 3 tasks, there's a unique feature identifying the task. But in general, you want to categorize the world into objects or as a American psychologist said, affordances, and into things, not based on their sort of native features per se, but rather in, are they going to be useful? And so, if you're in a dark alley and there's people coming towards you and you need some kind of weapon to protect yourself, it might be a piece of wood, it might be a pipe, it might be a stone. But what do those things have in common? They have some feature that would help you in this task. And so, there are people in vision looking at ways to convert these elementary geometric and mass properties description of objects into some sort of tool-like feature. So that problem is being worked on, but not by me.
Well, actually, also in your experiment, you showed that the eye movement trajectory varied with whether the object had to be avoided or not.
Yes.
Right? Because then I think you also showed that in case it was, let's say, a to be avoided object in the task, the eye movements were more at the edges, so you wouldn't bump into it. While if it was more a viewing related task, the eye movements were more going towards the center of the object. So in that sense, I think this also that shows how the affordance of that object varies depending on the task. That in turn translates in the eye movement behavior. Is that correct?
That's true. And that sort of gets us into the sort of research that would unify what you and I are sometimes doing, is this idea of embodied cognition. So it's actually not only the properties of the object, but it's the interaction of the user of the object and the object itself. It's sort of how the human is coupled to the world, and which would lead us to perhaps the most shocking topic of all is in the eye movement. The original thinking was that when the eyes looked out in the world and captured an image, that somehow that image was copied in the brain in some way. And so people quickly debunked that, because then there would have to be somebody in the brain looking at that image, and then that never stops. So when the other end of the spectrum that is getting a lot of weight is that when you look at a certain place, you actually are not painting an image at all, but you're after this property that we talked about. They were after some feature of the spot you're looking at. There's some information you want, and like you mentioned, going around an object, you look at the edge because you want to rotate around the object. Where if you're picking up, you look for the center because you want to go right towards it. And so this is an idea that really takes a lot of time to get used to. The idea that every third of a second, that when you move your eyes to a point, you're doing that for some visual test. If it's reading, you're trying to decode the word you're looking at in the text. But in the real world, if you're picking up objects or you have some tests or cooking, driving a car, the tests get very interesting and different in each case. And one of the tests is to see if somehow we can categorize all the different tests that you do.
But now this would illustrate this notion of your agenda, if you want, dictating how you deal with objects in the world visually, how you actually extract information from these objects, right? But now this could be interpreted in 2 ways. Either you could say, like, well, in the object affordance relationship, like the object, what you can do with it, gets defined in a rather different way. That's almost a different category. It's not, in some sense, internally the same object. Or you could argue, well, actually, you really detect the same object. It's still the same sort of obstacle, but the same shape. And in both cases, you extract that. But it's more like a biasing of how you process that object. So which of these 2 interpretations would you favor?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a tricky one. I mean, it really gets in I think we have to go back to agenda driven, you know, so when you pick a particular agenda item to work on, when you pick the task, that task has, the properties of the object you're interacting with, written in some internal form. And so you just have to, query the world to see if the object you're looking at in fact satisfies those properties. And so I'm trying to think. I know this is going to come down one side or the other of your question, but I'm going to let you pick one.
Okay. Well, so my bet would be that you build up a scene, which will contain this object, but I think the way you bias it with respect to your action will vary. So it's not. On the other hand, you could then argue that's okay, but if you would look at example of let's say inattentional blindness, then the objects are actually out there, but you're not seeing them because not related to your agenda. So in that sense, it looks like it's a difficult problem to solve at this stage. But you were the one giving the talk, and not me. So I mean, you're the one who has to solve it now for me.
I see. Well, but I think you opened the door to attentional blindness, and perhaps we should just revisit the idea that in the rather astonishing variety of experiments done by Dan Simons and others, that people don't know huge changes in their visual world. And one of the famous examples is some variant of a person's approaching a counter, and like you would if you're checking into a hotel and you're dealing with the clerk. But of course, it's an experiment. So the clerk ducks under the table to get something, supposedly, and there's a person hiding behind there, and another person pops up. And the person, if the person who replaces the original person is only vaguely similar, the person who came to the table would never notice the difference. And so the thinking, of course, from what we call our Cartesian view of the world, where everything's a picture and there are objects in it that we can sort of label, like an inverse paint by numbers world, that just defies explanation, because we should notice the changes. But in an agenda-driven view of the world, well, we don't, because we can be nice to the clerk and polite, but we don't expect the relationship to go on forever, and so we don't code a lot of details about what the person looks like or et cetera, et cetera. So that the change blindness example is actually a quintessential example of agenda-driven vision at work.
Exactly.
You just need the features to do the job. And so I would say that the fact that in our manufactured world, we give lots of things helpful hints, like putting them in cylinders and writing Coke on them. But for the most part, we come prepared to just exploit the functional features of something in getting to the tool use stage.
Right. So then, from that perspective, so in this agenda-driven view of perception, then your gaze behavior becomes one of, if you want, information seeking or uncertainty reduction was the notion you used for that. So how does that relate exactly to the agenda-driven view?
Well, so let's see. We'd have to try to summarize this succinctly. And so one central issue in the brain and how the brain uses vision is, of course, that you have these agenda items, which we think of as programs, internal programs that neurons are in charge of. And the question is, how does that all happen? And while we don't know even the beginnings of it, we have some clues. And one is that what the brain has to do is be its own programmer. So if you're working for a company, you can be a programmer and write programs for it. But if you, the person, have internal programs, how do you code them? And so the prevailing view is that somehow the neural system has a way of suggesting programs, and then you would score them as to how effective they are. And this internal scoring is believed to be this chemical molecule dopamine. So dopamine is like an internal currency. I call it in the classroom, I call it the neuro in honor of the euro. but it's just an internal pay scale for rating different programs. And the idea of you as a surviving person who wants to spread your genes around, you try to earn the most. You're designed to earn the most neurons. And the neurons are the neurons in your head. They can't see out. They just have to deal with what their internal structures are. And so that, so they do things like these visual tests and try the visual test. Everyone comes, with its own, rate of return. And the internal agenda-driven programs that you're running, they are all worth something. And some part of you is trying to pick the best ones.
Mm-hmm. But now, what makes me earn neurons exactly?
Oh, you come out of the box. You come out of the box as a neuro
accumulator.
Neuro accumulator. It's rather interesting. No,
but are you saying I'm out there really trying to collect drops of juice and sugar and sex, drugs, and rock and roll? Or am I also earning neurons for doing other things?
The answer is both. Mm-hmm. So your brain evolved in stages, and the part we associate with being some kind of a computer is the forebrain. And so that's the last to go. And it's very complicated. It has lots of parts that we could talk about, but maybe we shouldn't. But it sits on top of an earlier system that contains the chemical rewards and the neurons that are communicating in this computer part that gives reward. They're dopaminergic neurons. And so you have a vast system of wires that goes through all your modern forebrain. But the part down in the brainstem that's handing this out is right next to the part that has your basic rewards, your drives, the 4 F's they're called, for fight, flee, feed, and reproduction.
Right.
And so basically the way your brain works, the forebrain works, even though you do these elaborate programs like algebra and physics and trading on the stock market, they all have to communicate somehow with the basic drives. So the basic drive, somehow your forebrain comes up with has to do the elaborate translation of why you're doing what you're doing is worth this reward.
Mm-hmm. Right, but now if we map that back to gaze behavior, right? So you mentioned that gaze is driven by, let's say, the need to reduce uncertainty about the world. So now what makes me earn neurons? When I identify the spots that give me the maximum uncertainty reduction, or do I earn neurons for jumping to the spot where I get the juice reward?
Well, it depends how that can fall out in different ways in different contexts. But the fact that you've come this far means from the perspective that we share, I think, is that we've totally bought into this program. So there's some evidence, like Kenji Doya and others are suggesting another one of these molecules, serotonin, is responsible for risk. So if we think back to choosing one of these agenda-driven behaviors, and we don't really want to know what it is, we just want to know how to characterize it in the most basic sense. It's like a gamble. So how much reward and how much risk is it? And so the brain doesn't want to do these apples and orange comparisons. It wants to reduce everything to a common denominator. So how many neurons? What's the risk? So your internal programs, the way they run, it's like making a bet. And so from that perspective, the eye movement system can help by reducing risk. So if you can reduce the risk, then your bet will become more of a sure bet, and you're going to get more reward. And if the internal thing is matched to the external world, then it'll be an accurate rendition of the value to you.
And so also yesterday you showed in a more theoretical experiment where you also then try to, let's say, extract the neurons that a viewer would be accumulating with a certain scan path to the world, given a task. Right. So does that really make sense? So what the regularities? So if you map an eye movement pattern back to an inference on what the value would be or could be, How consistent is that? What you get out of that?
Well, I mean, in the lab, what can we do? So if we think we got it, so practically, a couple of things first. Practically, that people have shown that in the brain, the neurons are sensitive to dopamine reward. So there's miles and miles of evidence where people have recorded from the cells passing out reward and show they behave in a very consistent fashion. So the monkeys doing tasks are doing tasks under different circumstances, and under these circumstances, they should get more or less reward. And the actual neural recordings are very consistent, showing that they get more, the cells are firing more furiously, passing out more reward when they should. So that says, okay, well, maybe this is on the right track. But in terms of, what we're working on, that's one of the issues, is that, if you eat an apple, your body structure can convert that into calories for you. So your brain can be told, what's the calories to neurons conversion. But if you're writing a scientific paper and you get it accepted in a journal, how many neurons is that worth? And that's a delicate problem, is that you handing out the reward and you earning reward are the same person.
Right.
And so the question you raise of how to keep that in calibration is a very delicate and important one. And in the lab, we're not working with monkeys, we're working with human subjects in virtual environments. So we can change the environments in a way that would suggest the reward should behave in a certain way, or the uncertainty should interact with reward in a certain way. And then if those results come back consistently, then we think, we're on the right track.
Right. But now, if you look at this, one interpretation of the dopamine system, going back to Wolfram Schultz and others, would be that dopamine responds to unpredicted reward, right? But in some sense, if you take this sort of uncertainty reduction interpretation of gaze behavior, then I'm gazing to positions where I'm expecting something, right? So that means it's not an unexpected reward. If you hit the right spot and it helps you to reduce uncertainty, it's an expected reward. So then dopamine should not fire. So what did I miss?
You didn't miss anything, but you might have skidded over what we would think of as a fairly minor technical point. Is that what gets coded? How exactly is the information coded in the brain? And since basically the brain's programs are run over and over and over again, that, for example, eye movements, these fast eye movements we talked about, are made at the rate of 150,000 gaze points per day. And so for all the tasks like cooking, making coffee and stuff, you've done it many, many times. And so before you run the program, you have a very good estimate of what you should get. And so it's cheaper for the brain. This is Wolfram Schultz work predominantly. That it's cheaper for the brain to record the difference between what you thought you'd get and what you'd get. And there's a lot of evidence for this. This is the way the brain chooses, because it's just cheaper to keep track of when something isn't what you expected. Either way, you got more than expected or less than expected. So and technically, some of the algorithms that we use work on that principle. They work on the difference coding principle. But it's really, I would say, a bit secondary, because it's sort of a economical coding principle rather than the main lesson, which is the brain has to keep the secondary reward model of things.
But now the other issue, if you take this sort of the law of effect approach of Thorndike, which goes back to, which basically means as you optimize your rewards, so you reinforce the things that give you reward, and you try to stamp out, as he called it, the things that do not give you reward. Then in your case, you might end up following gaze patterns that are tuned to a certain task and a certain environment because they optimize reward, and that might be maladapted to, let's say, changes in that task or to other tasks. And then you have to first stamp out that whole gaze pattern you have acquired and reacquire another one from scratch. So it might lead to inefficiencies if you talk about switching between different tasks. So how would your model deal with that? So let's say we go from picking up litter to catching birds or something like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, we have to tie this back to some things we talked about at the beginning. Really, is this is the Gay's work. I should mention is the work of Nathan Sprague, who's a former PhD student, and I actually told him that when he started to think about this problem, I gave him the Thorndike line that I thought just looking at the right place should get you the most reward. And Nathan came back and explained to me, no, it's if you want to account for the data, then reducing the reward weighted uncertainty is the right way to go. Mm-hmm. So it's not reward per se, but it's the reduction in the looking increases the odds of winning your bet in our agenda driven world. And so he showed basically that the original Thorndike idea was unstable when you apply it to gaze. Mm-hmm. But if you did this product of reward and uncertainty, it was stable and actually could outperform the alternatives.
Right. Okay. So that would lead to a somewhat different interpretation of let's say the cues that drive reward. That would not be just, let's say, a flat out drop of juice or something like this, or some image that looks very pleasing. It is really the detection of an uncertainty reduction that in itself will be driving a reward signal.
Right.
That will be the interpretation of this, right?
Right.
Okay.
There's a very famous, perhaps we can add, there's a very famous tape from John Senders, who was really a pioneer in thinking about the information properties of gaze. And he asked the question, what if you can't use your eyes? And he built a very special device that would, while driving a car, it would eliminate his gaze for different amounts of times. This huge clamshell, came down and blocked his vision, and it was driven by a motor. So he could have it, obscured for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. And about 4 or 5 seconds while driving a car on the highway, you get into terrible trouble. And you really have a very visceral sense that it's the uncertainty on where you are that's the driving force. And I think this was Nathan's kind of insight too, is that it's when you have reward and uncertainty. In the case of gaze, it's the uncertainty that's dominating, and that needs to be paid attention to.
Right. So, but then, if we would take this literal interpretation of the dopamine signal as unexpected reward, would you say, look, this idea of uncertainty reduction as a reward driving signal, is it important for you that this gets mapped to dopamine, or you also would be happy if it would be some other neuromodulatory system that is conveying that signal to the rest of the brain? Or it's really specific for you to the dopamine system?
No, I mean, as a modeler, of course, it's a scalar something. And so if it was something else, that would be fine. But of course, like, the Nobel Prize has already been given out for the discovery of dopamine's role in this context. So you'd be swimming. We really don't know what a good alternative is in this place. And
no, but that's good. So you would fight and die more for the general idea of this scalar value.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be that, but there's a lot of evidence for it. And all the addictions like nicotine and cocaine are linked to breaking into the dopamine storehouse.
That's right. But how would, let's say, these addictions be informative on, let's say, uncertainty reduction? Right? I mean, sure that it relates to reward, that's clear. But your specific angle on it is the uncertainty reduction.
Well, okay. But we have to keep in mind where we started here is that we started thinking about vision, and we've started by this very esoteric and high performance gaze system that can really move the eyes to different parts in the visual world at speeds up to 700 degrees per second. So the eye movement system is really remarkable and very different. And so that at that end of the spectrum, with that part of the human machine, then uncertainty comes into play.
Right.
But when you're breaking into a house and taking the high definition television so that you can sell it and have more cocaine and more dopamine, then you're dealing with there are uncertainties, but you're really after the reward. The reward is driving you, and overwhelmingly so.
Yeah, okay, that's clear. So then you also showed experiments where you were generalizing this way of thinking to driving cars in virtual reality, right? So,
yes.
So why how were these experiments with following another car and trying to see? So people have a task to follow another car at a certain speed. This car moves along some highway, and what you're looking at is then the switching between the car you're following and the speedometer, because you have to stick to a certain speed.
Yes.
Right? So how has this been informative on this notion of uncertainty reduction?
Well, of course, like we talked about John Sender's experiment driving the car, and if you don't pay, of course, being a researcher, the style is to defend certain hypotheses that you're trying to run down. And so the thought was, well, driving is perhaps a little like walking down a sidewalk in the following senses. You have a limited agenda of things that you can do in this multitasking sense. And what could they be? And in the lab, we picked, in the demonstration you're talking about, we picked something simple or relatively simple, following a car at a certain speed, so dual task. And then in our subjects, in a virtual car, so we have a car simulator, the gaze pattern goes back and forth from the car they're following to the speedometer. But of course, we know in real life that multitasking in driving is critical. And in the U.S., there's a terrible problem with teenagers and texting and talking on the phone during driving. And so that's a very demanding task to be doing and competes often, sometimes fatally, with a normal driving task. Even in simple situations like driving on a freeway and things like that, people wander into the wrong lane. And finally, the television is trying to alert people, particularly young people, that they shouldn't do this. Of course, in the U.S., it's very hard to pass a law against anything because we're a free country. But this is definitely a place where we shouldn't be a free country. We shouldn't be texting and talking on the phone while driving the car.
Right.
But what it points out, though, I think, rather cruelly, is that this idea of uncertainty, because if you here's where you start multitasking on a phone, or typing something on an Android keyboard. Sorry for Android, any old phone.
Yeah.
And then that just steals your cycles, if you wish, computer cycles, and it steals your gaze. So your gaze is now staring at this keyboard when it should be looking out at driving. And so it's multitasking. So you're sneaking some gazes on the road, hopefully, but in the accidents, you're not doing it enough. And so you're just spending too much time on the keyboard, not enough time. But if you think it about abstractly, it's just one of these task things. So you're texting or you're looking at the road. Your gaze is going back and forth, and you're trying to make a decision about uncertainty. But since you're a teenager, you don't quite have the numbers right. And so you're not giving enough weight to looking at what you're doing.
Right, but how rapidly in this driving task, what can you say about, let's say, the speed or the rate at which this uncertainty increases over time? Is that, let's say, linear with time, or is there some other relationship?
Oh, we want to know, but that's a research question. I mean, we're trying to think exactly what kinds of manipulations we would do to pin that down. If we would be very, very, very satisfied if we could come up with some sort of model for that.
No? But you have it, no? Because it's the probability to see an eye movement from the car you're tracking to the speedometer or vice versa. Right? Like when a person looks at the speedometer, so now I'm not tracking the car. Now uncertainty about the position of the car is building up. So, and that should, I guess, correlate with now the probability to see a saccade back to the car. So if you would
you got it, Paul. And I think that's a good suggestion. And certainly we want to do something like that. The only thing that makes it tricky is we don't know from first principles how much reward we should give to the individual tasks. And so there's a confound. We can't quite, if we have a product of reward and uncertainty. And so the tricky part is to thinking of experiments that would decompose those factors so we could pin down how much of the factor is the reward and so much is the uncertainty. But so that's the only thing that makes it ticklish, but that's what we want to do.
But then you just can make it a game where the instruction varies from just worry about speed to just worry about the car and all combinations in between with some gradation. And then you want to plot the probability to see these eye movements from one to the other. And that would tell you then the uncertainty buildup, I guess.
At this point, I'm thinking we should bring you to Texas, where I'm from, because clearly, you can solve this problem for us.
Okay, good. You got a deal. But but this is great, right? Because now we're looking at perception as an agenda-driven, active process. With respect to, and the measured in eye movement. But then I could say, yeah, that's all really nice, Dana, but I think you're a bit too vision-centric because I'm not flapping my ears around in a similar way. Right? My ears have sort of almost omnidirectional access to the auditory world, to the sound pressure waves. So I don't have that problem. So I don't have to have the same kind of selectivity in now sucking in the information because I don't have something like an auditory phobia. Right.
But I have to say, so your listeners may not know that you're a relatively young person. And so if you were an old person, you would answer that question completely differently because.
So I lost my ticket to Texas now.
No. We have old people. Okay. Old people can come there too.
Okay.
No,
good.
I mean young people. What I think you remembered is in the auditory system, one nice illustration is the cocktail party effect. Whereas if you're in a crowded cocktail party and someone calls out your name, you immediately recognize it. And so what you can do with the auditory system, you really have something like the visual problem. Is that in a situation with lots and lots of background noise, that you can tune in to one particular speaker and one particular conversation. And so it's not exactly the same as vision, but it shares a lot of the same abstract features in that in the auditory picture, in the visual world, you want to pick out a place where the object of interest is. In the auditory world, you want to pick a part of the auditory spectrum where the actual voice signal is being generated. And so it's at an abstract level, some of the problems are quite similar. And also you have some ability, since you have two ears and the auditory signal is different depending on the location space it's coming from, you have some ability to filter the signal from where it's coming from in space. And so there are similarities. And so in an agenda where there's multiple speakers, that would be like multitasking.
Okay. So that means, so you would say, look, maybe the implementation might be somewhat different because I'm not flapping my ears around, but in both cases, you have an information bottleneck. It's like the central processing of information about the world is restricted.
Yes.
Right. So there's a limited bandwidth.
Absolutely.
And you have to pre-filter in some sense what you allow to enter. And that is done on the basis of this agenda that you're driving.
Right.
And you would say this would generalize to also olfaction or somatosensory information?
Yes. I mean, I think I'm not an expert in any of the other senses, but I think the other ones, certainly the haptic sense of like, for example, your skin. Everybody in Texas has had the sensation of ants crawling on them, and we do have fire ants where they're trained to bite simultaneously, and a lot of people are allergic, and they need to carry an EpiPen with them, and so they get when they get bitten, they have to inject themselves right away. But there you have the same kind of issue. You can think, let's leave a fire ant out of it and just take a regular ant. That a regular ant can crawl over all over your skin unnoticed, or you may be able to sense where it is in some part of your skin. And so there you have the same issue of you have space, your the skin covering your body, and then there's a location on it where something of interest is happening, and you know it becomes, some of these things become rather similar. Olfaction and taste, maybe we have to give them special exemptions.
Right, exactly. No, but this is very good, right? Because this would imply that from this perspective of uncertainty reduction, right, you can really have a modality independent view of this process. Right, this is the power of what you're doing. Right? So this is very good.
Absolutely.
So we're not stuck with vision alone.
No.
Very good. So now, now that you solved the vision problem, Then you thought, okay, now I solved vision. Let's do motor control. Right? So you jumped into motor control. Why did that happen?
Well, I moved to Texas, and when we moved the lab to Texas for a lab that we had, to recreate it, it's quite expensive. So the University of Texas at Austin gave us a very nice package that allowed us to recreate the lab in a new location. But in that move, I made a personal decision that we should start taking more risks, since rather than continue exactly on the same line that we were doing. And so we thought that we would take a look at moving the body, not just the eyes, but what if you move the rest of the body? What would that look like computationally? So what we do is this embodied cognition field, which is rather strange because you build these computer models of the human, and you try to respect a lot of the knowledge coming out of neuroscience and psychology. But within those boundaries, you try to find what the principles are, like you just did this wonderful summary of what we're about in terms of getting abstract models. And so we thought we'd try to do that for motor control. And we've started, it's just all new and different. We have what's called MoCap, motion capture system, that allows us to capture the movement of our entire body, and making arbitrarily poses and motions. And then we have, we can convert that to a skeletal representation. So we have this elaborate computer software package developed at Stanford, OpenSim, and that allows you to have what we can loosely characterize as half a human. So a human has 600 muscles and what they call 300 degrees of freedom, or let's call them joints. And the software package has just half of that. So 300 possible muscles and 150 possible joints, or degrees of freedom, as we call them. And so we've been working with that to try to come up with abstract characterizations of movements, and that we're making some headway, we think.
Okay. But now, in looking at this motor control issue, you drew a parallel between, let's say, your standard robot or humanoid robot and a cat in this case, right? So what are, let's say, the obvious differences between these two? Like, what makes a robot so different from a cat?
Well, it's a delicate thing to explain, but it centers around the notion of abstraction. And the easiest way to start is with Mozart. So if you take sheet music, everything Mozart ever wrote fits on one CD. But of course, he was very prolific, and he wrote hundreds of things. And if you have the CD for all the music that's not coded in sheet music, it'll take many, many, many CDs. And so the thought is, so what's the difference? It's because, let's think in terms of the piano. The code is, the piano has keys, but then each key plays a complicated note. And so playing the note per se gets all these high frequency vibrations going. And that's expensive to reproduce. Whereas the actual note, it's very easy to write down the symbol that will do that. So in the same way, the cat, you mentioned the cat, and also humans for that matter, have a spinal cord. And so, but it comes before the brain, and inside the spinal cord is what's called pattern generators that are very loosely loosely could be put in correspondence with a piano. So basically your spinal cord is playing the role of the piano, and then your brain then just has to have the sheet music and play the spinal cord. And that's the insight where the particular path we're going down and looking into. Right. Whereas if you take a conventional robot, most conventional robots do not have this concept. And so basically there's no concept of sheet music. You're actually creating the notes with very, very high performance silicon computation.
Right. But then, so if you look at this encapsulation, because it's basically what you're saying, right? So you have a basic functionality encapsulated at your spinal cord level. Let's say I might have something like these force fields I'm controlling on my spinal cord, so I can move the effectors in some space. And then how many piano players are you considering above that? Is that that's one? But for instance, the brainstem might be pushing these keys, and then the frontal areas might be pushing the keys of the brainstem, etc. Right? So how many layers of piano players would you consider?
Well, roughly, I would say we'll make one more distinction before we get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want a movement that's repetitive, that's a part of all your movements. So one thing that in the spinal cord, I should have one little elaboration that will make things simpler, is that rather than have a different, what's the size of the piano, we could be arguing. And
Mm-hmm.
Mathematically, there'd be a way of basically playing chords so that you can have some basic keys, frequencies, and then combine them in many, many different ways. And so you can get a huge spectrum of movements rather cheaply in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But another problem you face is that when you put on your backpack to go home as a student, then you've changed where your center of gravity is. So all the movements that are carefully designed to keep you from falling over won't work unless they get some help.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a part of your brain that's much older than the forebrain. It's called the cerebellum.
Mm-hmm.
And so inside the cerebellum, that it's been shown that the job of the cerebellum is just to put these temporary adaptations in there. And so one big thing you have to solve before we get to the question you raised is load balancing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something about your body that's changed in some way. You're swimming in the ocean, or you got a backpack on, or something strange has happened. It has to be adjusted. That's the cerebellum.
Mm-hmm.
So once the cerebellum is putting that capability, then now we come to the task that you put on us, and that is that you somehow, if you have a movement like getting the kettle off the stove or whipping up an omelet, those movements, some coordinates in the world have to be translated into coordinates in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And so the forebrain is really in charge of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't know how this is done. Nobody knows how this is done. But what might be, what the job might be is believed to be somehow doing this translation.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow the newer forebrain has to take the task requirements and put them into some sheet music like code.
Right.
And we know this isn't easy because the forebrain itself is organized into layers. So you start out with basic ideas, and then you put more and more abstract layers on top of it. So the code for these movements is not going to be easy to find out. But at least we have some ideas on how it might be organized.
Right. But then, so the model would be a little bit like I have my piano keys in my spinal cord. Then I have, let's say, some sort of background modulator, which is the cerebellum, that keeps this all a little bit calibrated. And then you have your piano player in a forebrain structure pushing specific keys so you can actually walk the stairs, something like this. This would be the model.
Yes.
So then,
yes. But then it's almost like you're an expert musician. So you can somehow chunk huge pieces of music into one common code that you remember. So you can kind of economize it. It's almost like any other kind of athlete where you find huge sections of body movements you can repeat from memory without thinking about it because they're sort of coded by rote. And so the forebrain is sort of the generator of these kinds of more and more advanced codes.
Yeah, but so now we have this multi-stage system. But if you now go back to the robotics example, there's a very standard procedure of how to control movement, because you would say, okay, look, I want to move the endpoint to some XYZ position in space. And now I just need some sort of inverse a model that now maps that to the forces I have to apply to my joints, and then I move my endpoint in space. This, however, turns out to be a tricky problem. Right. But so do you see then this division you see between spinal cord, cerebellum, forebrain, as we just sketched it, as mapping onto that division that engineers are using in the control of robots, or that's sort of another kind of solution? It's
another kind of solution. I think it's a huge fork in the road. And I don't know if this would help, but we could think of trigonometry. So if we take the function, the sine of an angle, we have an angle, we want its sine function. And so there's two ways in computers, there's two ways to do that. One is you could take small divisions of angle and pre-compute the sine for each one of those. So you can have a table, an elaborate table. You supply the angle, I get that angle, and I go to my table and I look up what's the sine. So in that table, it's rather spacious, but it's very fast. And the other way to do it is I could use a series expansion. So for sine, we could, what's the sine of theta? Well, it's theta, minus theta squared over factorial 2 plus theta cubed over factorial 3. I think I'm remembering the formula correctly, but you can write out a formula for it. And then, every time you want to know the value of an angle, you could just run it through the summation, which you can roll out to whatever accuracy you want. So let's summate the two approaches. One is you have your table and that has the fast lookup. And then the other one is you compute it as needed, but the computation is much more extensive. One table lookup, many, many terms to be computed and added up together. Right. And so you could think of the robotics approach. One interpretation of the robotics approach is it's very much the series expansion mode, the computationally intensive mode, in which we can go down that road because the computers are so fast. We have a lot of cycles, so it's tempting to use them. Whereas if you can think of the body and the human body as not having the cycles because the neural hardware is over 1 million times slower than silicon, so that the human has to use these stable lookup approaches. And so furthermore, the table lookups are sort of burned in over evolution and also development. Each human starts out not knowing how to make movements, and then you sort of rather painstakingly fall on the floor, learn to crawl, learn to raise your head, et cetera, et cetera. And so you burn them in over years. You're willing to take the time to develop the movements you'll need as an adult. So
it's like you're trading off memory versus processing.
Exactly. It's exactly right.
So you would think that in this division that you just earlier made of the brain, it actually relies on memory to do this, to perform this task efficiently, as opposed to computing this all the time, right?
And these ideas have been around a long time. They're not new. And Chris Atkinson had him early on at MIT and then Georgia Tech, but amongst others. But a lot of math has been developed to come up with more compact codes. So the codes for these tables are becoming cheaper and cheaper, so that they're becoming more possible as being conceptualized as the way the humans might be doing it.
So what's the benchmark you would like to put out there also for the roboticists, to which you would like to also compare your own solutions in this kind of motor control task? What would be a benchmark that you think is plausible and convincing?
Well, I have a graduate student, Joseph Cooper, and his benchmark is he's making a racquetball player. And so he has to get his PhD, he'll have a racquetball player that he can play against. So he can play
in the physical world, or
in the virtual world, in the virtual world.
Okay.
So his virtual, an avatar of him, will play against another avatar.
Right.
And may the best avatar win.
Okay. I agree with that. So Dana, I mean, you're around in this business for a while, made incredible progress on this understanding of perception, active vision. What would you see as Dana's law? What's Dana's law that we should adhere to in understanding the brain?
Well, I think as an academic, it's hard to have a law because no one obey you. That's the nature of your colleagues.
It's an ideal world. Everybody will obey Dana's law.
That's right. Well, I think one thing I do think that is sorely needed in understanding the brain, we'd all like to understand the brain, is the idea an idea that is totally essential to silicon computation. That's abstraction. So that we can't even think about computation without think of different layers of abstraction. So you have, the operating system that runs your program. You have your program that's written in a high level language. That program gets translated into machine language. that program gets translated into a microcode that the particular machine architecture they can understand. That code runs on gates, right? The gates are composed of layers of silicon, and it keeps going and going. And so if we didn't have this essential concept of layers of abstraction, we'd be stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And Alan Newell really, he articulated this most elegantly in his book, Unified Theories of Cognition. But I think that's missing. And I think what we really need, and I think what the math developments, all the math modeling and machine learning and that it's helping us with, is we really need those kinds of concepts in thinking about how the brain works, because it's obvious, or at least we think it's very, very necessary for the brain to succeed. It has to be somehow organized into layers of abstraction. And in these coarse things of spinal cord, et cetera, we can come up with good guesses. But when we get to the forebrain, we're not done. And I think that's really the work site, is to go into the forebrain and try to figure out what are the useful layers of abstraction that the brain is using.
So Dana's law is abstraction is good for you.
That's right.
Excellent.
Twice a day.
Very good. So then to finish up, 5 years from now, well, probably earlier, but let's say 5 years from now, I'm going to come down to Texas, and I'm going to remind you of a hypothesis you want to generate today, which is what hypothesis do you feel most passionate about today that I can ask you about 5 years from now, and then it will turn out to be verified?
Well, I'll pick one of many hypotheses. Right, and will this be like a beer bet that if it's actually
more serious than that?
More serious, like a dinner out? What are we talking here?
That's nothing.
Oh,
Dana. Come on, we talk about serious bets.
The housing market, maybe it's recovered by then. No.
Now you're talking. Yeah, okay.
Here's one rather specialized hypothesis that's very important to me. And we talked about the forebrain. And inside the main memory system of the forebrain is the cortex. And the neurons in the cortex, they communicate by sending spikes. And those spikes are sent at very low rates. So somewhere 10 spikes per second, 50 spikes per second. Those are the communication channels of nerve cells in the brain's main memory system. And one of the most popular current hypothesis is rate coding. So neurons are trying to send a number to the other neurons they communicate with. And one of the astonishing things that the brain's memory system has, each cell can talk faithfully to 10,000 other cells. And this is a feat that silicon can't come close to. And so the thought is that these other cells, what they want to know is they want to know what this number is, and how they estimate is by counting spikes. And so I just think that for a variety of reasons, this is untenable, because you just can't communicate fast enough to do programs, and the what's called rate coding hypothesis is actually a correlate of different kinds of codes that the neurons actually use. And so 5 years from now, this will be generally believed to be true. And so as a wonderful substitute, is that the brain uses some kind of latency code. So that each little agenda task has a clock, and in what's called the gamma frequency, that's somewhere between 30 and 90 hertz. Each agenda task gets a frequency, and then the spikes can send a little analog number by delaying their spike with respect to the clock pulse. So if you're right on the clock pulse, you're a big number. If you're delayed, you're a smaller number. And so the actual spikes are actually numbers. And if you can do that, then all of a sudden the doors are open for a lot of fast communication. So if you want a prediction, that's my prediction, that 5 years from now, a spike will be a number.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So Dana Ballard, thank you very much for this conversation.
Oh, I was delighted to be here, Paul. You and I have been friends for a long time, and it was fun to do this too.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.